So it's production day on the one-day doc project. And if you haven't seen my video on the pre-production for a one-day doc piece, then check that out up here at some point. I have 8 tips on how to make this day give you the best results you can get for your mini doc before you actually show up on set. But the day has finally come and we are on site with my subject. Now, the most important thing you can do to get great results is to focus on the relationships and making this as wonderful of an experience as you can for the people you are working with. The lighting, the gear, the set will only make a documentary so good. It's the people and the story that matters most. If they're comfortable around you, if they feel that you appreciate them, if they like you, you are going to get great content, and that will make your documentary so much better. Now, I will say at the onset, for this shoot, I did bring along an assistant, and normally I am a solo operator, but I wanted to run 2 cameras, film 2 interviews, set up lighting, sound, collect good B-roll, and I wanted to do it in about 2 hours. And that would be a pretty tall order on my own, so I wrangled a colleague in for helping me on this shoot. And that said, all of the tips here apply to both a solo operated or a crew operated set. Now, because I was able to park within 100 feet of the small shop we'd be filming in, I first went in to reintroduce myself before bringing in all of my gear. And this goes to that first tip on production day, making the experience as much about human connection and relationship as possible rather than the interview. If you pile in with a bunch of gear, start talking about setup and schedule, and disrupt their space with your agenda, you aren't going to get great content or vibes from the interview. This was especially important in this case because it was only the second time I had met these folks in person, and I had approached them about the project rather than them approaching me to do a mini doc. Now, after a brief greeting, introduction of who my assistant was, some warm smiles and handshakes, I then told them that I was going to go out, get my gear and set up, but they're welcome to continue their work because it's going to take me some time to get ready. Now, step 2 is to pick out the interview location. And ideally, you want to shoot the interview first and then the B-roll because the verbal content should always drive the visual cut afterward. And I look for 2 things, light and background. Where are your available light sources, and can you use them or not? Where will you need to set up additional lights? Can you turn off or flag available lighting? What are the color temps, and can you work with that? Next, what are going to be the best looking backgrounds that will accentuate the characters or the story of your piece? Can you get enough depth of field from the background in relation to the camera, the subject, and the background for a nice depth of field? And will this background work with the lighting to light the subject's face in the way that you want? In my case, I wanted some backlight, but also a smidge of Rembrandt lighting. Unfortunately, I don't have examples of what the interview would have looked like without the additional lighting and just using available lighting, but with my lights, I do think it looks pretty solid. Also, these are of course completely ungraded, untouched clips. I'll be leaving the grading to the next video in this series where I get into the post-production. Tip 3, pay special attention to anything and everything in their space and put it back exactly the way it was or better. At the end of the shoot, take time to put furniture back the way it was, clean up trash, put window blinds back where they were, anything like that. Now, I mention that here because you're going to need to take note of this kind of stuff at this stage in the process. Always leave a place better than you found it, and make the experience in working with you so great that you leave the people better than you found them too. Tip 4 is focus on getting great sound. Sound is just as important as the visual, sometimes even more important. Personally, I like to use both a lavalier mic and a shotgun mic on all interviews. I like multiple mics and channels of sound to give me a well-rounded, full-bodied sound that fits the environment, but also captures the voice with as much quality as possible. It's also saved my butt if one of the channels or mics fails, and then I have a second quality track rather than resorting to camera scratch audio. Personally, I don't mind seeing the lav tactfully clipped to a collar or jacket. People have seen lavs enough in interviews for them not to be a complete eyesore, but I will say I always try to hide the wire. Having a person hold the lav or having the wire hang down the front of the shirt is a big distraction. But completely hiding the mic by using body or clothing tape is a little too awkward for me personally. I usually just ask the person to feed this up underneath your shirt and then we can clip it to your collar. Once they have it up their shirt, I usually hand them the body of the lav and tell them they can put this in their pocket if they have one, and I'll clip it to their collar. Normally, I also boom a shotgun mic overhead as close to the subject as possible without getting it in frame. In this case, however, I had one camera so wide that this was not possible, so I put the shotgun mic on the camera itself. It wasn't ideal, but it works. And here's where I made a mistake. I had the audio fairly balanced to begin with, but not dialed in perfectly for my first subject. So when I asked my first question of the interview, I realized that one of my channels of audio was off. The answer was golden, so I didn't want to adjust the audio mid-take and perhaps create a headache in my edit, but I should have begun with a question that was not as important to the interview, but would have given me good audio basis. What did you eat for breakfast is usually not a good question because either the person has too short of an answer, like cereal, or I don't eat breakfast, and that doesn't help me dial in the audio levels, or they talk in tones and inflections that are not like how they would talk during the interview later. I should have just asked him to explain the project he's currently working on, or something like that. But after his first answer, I had the audio balanced and we were good to go. Along with this tip is to make sure that all controllable ambient sound is turned off. If something important needs to be turned off and you are concerned about forgetting to turn it back on again, put your keys next to it. You won't be able to leave without remembering to turn it on again. Tip 5, as I mentioned in the last video, has to do with the interview, and that is I had all of my questions memorized, so I never held or looked at a piece of paper. I maintained eye contact, visual affirmation on points that were made, took interest in him as a person, and listened to answers. And listening is important. Whenever I can ask a follow-up question that could only have come by listening to what the person just said, this gains rapport and makes them more relaxed and conversational. I did give my assistant the full list of questions and asked him at the end of the interview if I missed anything important for a safety net. Tip 6 is more of a personal preference thing. I had 2 cameras on the shoot, and though I wanted or envisioned some of the shots of the subject looking right into the camera like I am now, I really don't like cutting back and forth between the person looking at the camera and then seeing them from the side, kind of like this. Going from this kind of a view to this kind of a view is as distracting to me as trying to hold a conversation with someone who isn't making eye contact with me. When the interviewee looks into the camera, they're making a personal connection with the audience and speaking directly and heartfeltly to the audience. When looking off camera, it's a little more formal and almost journalistic. It becomes more about the topic being discussed than the person, an expert more than a personal coach. Both of these approaches are totally and equally legitimate. I believe you just have to figure out which fits the story better. And personally, I don't like mixing the two. I find it jarring and it brings attention to the fact that you're watching an interview. I know it's a popular style, but I suggest you stay away from it. Now, I mentioned it briefly in passing, but tip 7 is when it comes to B-roll, try to capture anything relevant that comes from the interviews. So for instance, Chris mentioned the first time a tool chest was mentioned in a woodworking book, and I happen to know that he had a copy of that book. So after the interview, I asked him to get it, and we got some shots of him leafing through the pages. Also, get a mixture of wide, medium, and close-up. Anytime you're capturing a person doing something, get a wide shot of them doing the task, a close-up of their hands and or the work itself, and a close-up of their face as they're doing the work. This gives you sequences to edit with rather than just shots, and you'll thank yourself later. Now, tip 8 is remember the 180 rule when shooting B-roll. Film your subject from one side. Imagine a line going from the back of the subject's head through his nose and stay on the one side of that line. Basically, the person should always be looking towards the same direction on screen. If they flip-flop, it's usually distracting. That said, if you break up a sequence with a cutaway to the interview and then back to B-roll, but you've jumped the line of access, you should be okay. So for instance, this kind of an edit is distracting because it jumps a line of access. Our subject is looking and working one direction, suddenly goes in the other way, and then back to the first. But if I start with this shot and go to a corresponding angle and then to a third, it works beautifully. And now if I cut to me as if I'm the interview and I talk a little bit and then cut back to the B-roll, but this time I'm filming from the other side of the character, it's far less jarring. All that to say is try to focus on being on just one side of the subject as you get all the sequence shots, like their face, their hands, their wide shot. If you think the other side of them will yield a great shot, get another sequence over there. Tip 9 is try to backlight your B-roll as much as possible. Take a look at these 2 shots. Even without color grading, which looks better or more interesting? Backlighting is a cinematic technique. Watch a serious drama or action movie, and more times than not, you will see backlighting. Corporate videos, fashion videos, and rom-coms tend to be front-lit, but I'm learning to go backlit for my documentary work. It makes a difference. The shoot went well, and all in all, I think we were on set about 2.5 hours, and I know we left with both Chris and Megan smiling and open to me contacting them if I needed anything, and that was a great sign. Well, I hope this video was helpful for you, because though I won't be seeing you in the next video, you're sure to see me rough.